Hey, hey everyone, Happy New Year. First off I want to start, it's actually almost emotional for me to see Liz up here talking about this stuff. You know, I think in the past couple of years she's kind of created a new category in music journalism that I hope more people kind of contribute to over time. And yeah, it's really spiriting to see so many people here to talk and think about this stuff when, you know, just a few years ago this felt very much the domain of kind of the tin hat wearing conspiracy theorist. But it's absolutely true, and it's absolutely quite bleak. And so sadly, I mean, I wrote a overview of, you know, what I wanted to present today, and then ended up yesterday just kind of writing a screed that ended up feeling quite pessimistic, but also quite important to share. And so, yeah, ignore everything that is in the program. I'm basically just going to read kind of an attempt at like an unfiltered excavation of the way things are at the moment, and then maybe some potential alternative directions or avenues that we might want to look at taking. Some of those directions that I'm going to be looking at will involve, you know, decentralized protocols, some cryptocurrency adjacent stuff. And I always want to make a disclaimer at the beginning. When I talk about this stuff, I'm not trying to sell this as kind of a kind of hokey, bountiful future for the independent musician. At this point, I'm pretty much in battleship mode. I'm pretty much in recovery. How the fuck do we salvage any of this mode? So yeah, just that. I'm not up here like a kind of Valley VC investor trying to sell you on Bitcoin or something. I'm trying to think of a method by which we can salvage some of the stuff that maybe we all cherish. I just want to double check. Are my slides coming through at all? There should be like a pink hand. No? Oh, there it is. It's not pink, at least to me. Yeah, anyway, so to start out, as I say, this is quite an unstructured thing, but I wanted to be honest with you. So some thoughts, assumptions, biases. So it might well get worse before it gets better. One assumption that I'm taking is that no one is going to pay for music anymore sufficient to keep scenes as we know going. At least not in the ways many have been used to. So while some artists might make change from digital sales through Bandcamp, my assumption is that these figures will dwindle over time as streaming establishes greater supremacy. My assumption is also that whichever streaming platform wins, as all roads lead to monopoly in this economy, the artists that benefit from that streaming platform, as Liz has done such a great job of pointing out, will be those artists that most dutifully satisfy the requirements of that streaming platform, which I think is a very different aspiration than satisfying the requirements of feeding in healthy international and local music scenes. So also, you know, Liz brought up the quote earlier where Daniel Ek says he wants 1 million artists living from Spotify. When I hear that, I think of 1 million musicians sitting in flat shares, stocking playlists for people to shower to. And I think that's a far cry from anything people attending CTM really care about. My other assumption is that Spotify might not succeed. So if I were Google or Amazon or Apple, who are way, way bigger fish, I would look at Spotify's immense burn rate. So they posted an operating loss of $460 million on revenue last year. $460 million on revenue of nearly $5 billion last year. And I would bide my time, because from where I stand, I see them spending immense amounts of money to reorder the way music works as we know it, but they haven't yet turned a profit. So they might well eradicate the traditional label and publishing model by finding new ways for artists to post directly to their platform, which they're working on. And they might well lock those artists into new forms of agreements over their work that also indemnifies them of any prospective parent company from legal action over copyright infringing material that might be hosted on their servers. SoundCloud has also done this recently, so they'll post new agreements that say, hey, we'll give you a preferential streaming rate in return for you saying you won't sue us. So in lieu of a viable business model appearing, all I read from that is that these are moves that leave the door open to potential acquisition by a bigger fish. So unless either of those services can find a way to turn a healthy profit, they're currently doing a lot of work on behalf of the bigger fish that may eventually step in to acquire them when their moonshot business models potentially fail. So another bias of mine, local niche models are wonderful, and I support them with my time and my money, but insufficient in the face of the platform monopolies. Basically, if you're set up to play the same game as them, you will be trampled. I've tried more than most to test this assumption, and have moved on in my thinking. I don't think there will be a streaming competitor to Spotify. or whoever might acquire them. Our best bet is to drastically reconsider the value proposition of music. What do we value, and what are we willing to pay for, collectively? The good news is that this is a far more interesting and kind of exciting conversation to have. So I'm switching? Oh yeah, this was supposed to be there for my kind of doomsday prophecies. That's a club gate. So I think club music is interesting because it's a bit of an anomaly that everyone can learn from. So a cold light of day reading of trends over the past 10 years, the rise of every scene attempting in some way to find some compatibility with club music, is that the club music economy is resilient in ways that other scene economies are not. So unlike traditional music venues and the bands that occupy them, club music is a lean and efficient economic engine. Club artists have lower overheads. DJs can switch their set every night, sufficient to be able to play the same city multiple times a year. And the club experience is durational and thus profitable in different ways than band music. So venue band music is more kind of a la carte. People develop strong associations with acts that have the good fortune to catch their attention in a crowded marketplace, usually on Spotify playlists, sadly. And people drop in and drop out. Club music, on the contrary, is very much based on location and loyalty and is more generalized and functional. People go to dance and are often less concerned with who is playing than what they are playing. As a result, those spaces become very powerful in their own right, and a minority of interesting artists can successfully make careers for themselves by establishing relationships with those spaces and their expectations. I always bring up Berghain as a wonderful example of a space that has a local protocol, right? Berghain dictates what happens within Berghain's walls, and if you work well with that protocol, you can make a career within Berghain. So I think that's great, but ultimately, as with streaming, the artists that thrive in those spaces are the ones that can best satisfy the requirements of the club, which are very, very different kind of functional requirements than one would ask of a musician and say, you know, you have a blank canvas, what would you like to create? The expectations of the club are very utilitarian in that way. So, you know, both club music and streaming require a fast and steady stream of somewhat anonymous compositions that transition seamlessly into one another. So it's music to work to on the streaming side, music to play to on the club side. It's this seamless experience, and anyone who's been to kind of one of the big kind of DJ festivals, like a Dekmantel, for example, which I've played in the past and I don't want to get into trouble with them, but you see this weird scenario where people turn up with their AirPods, listening to their playlists and or their mixes that are being pushed out by magazines, and then seamlessly transitioning almost kind of quantized to the formulaic 4/4 beat that plays for like 4 days in a row. So this is all well and good, but again we're left asking, what about those musicians who don't want to tailor their output to a predetermined function? What happens? What happens to them? So one of the significant battles we face at the moment is a war between music from nowhere and music from somewhere. Right? So music designed for instantaneous engagement and instantaneous dismissal, which I think Liz covered beautifully, and music that communicates with an archive, with a history, with a place, with a location. And that archive is collapsing, and who will preserve it? More magazines will die. That's happening right now. More magazines will die. I know of a few that are dying that haven't been announced yet. Many that are hanging on do so due to the clever side business models that don't depend on journalism turning a profit. The role of the critic has been under threat for some time and will continue to lose influence to this kind of algorithmic populism, shady algorithmic populism, opaque algorithmic populism, and the kind of process hack algorithmic manipulation that makes stars on Instagram and YouTube. Spotify and Apple are already hiring journalists to cover the work they promote on their platform, so we will see more hagiographical journalism feeding that system. And the traditional idea of the critic as an arbiter of taste and gatekeeper of an archive or of a history or of a legacy will continue to be eroded. Other gatekeepers, such as labels and niche festivals, will continue to lose prominence over time unless they radically reconsidered their value in the world. The end of history? No, but it's the end of an era. Another cold light of day kind of rereading of the surge of poptimism in the press over the past decade is to see it as the bargaining stage of grief over the seemingly inexorable charge of bot-like popular figures who hoover up ideas from the margins and deploy significant resources to capture a moment with music fortified from any potentially critical angle what one might level at it. Pop stars in this kind of model are better understood as monarchic CEOs of content production studios atop a feudal, trickle-up creative economy. They have adapted to the online ecosystem far faster than the critical systems that might one day have raised objection to them. For many, the only thing to do now is to sit back and commentate, on Twitter usually, like a Formula One spectator, as these fast and furious culture-scanning vehicles whiz past everybody. So, who can protect the archive? Bit of a caveat here. The recent announcement that Condé Nast intends to paywall all of its publications, presumably including Pitchfork by 2020, is interesting. I like it when people pay for things. It's going to be a call to see, whether that fortifies an archive or kind of alienates the archive even further from people because they are unable to access it. But I actually welcome experiments with paywalls. It's one thing that some people don't like about me, but I quite appreciate people buying things. So on the other hand, we have organizations like Red Bull Music Academy and Boiler Room, who have found ways to leverage brand money to keep things visible and accessible. Archiving, as far as I can tell, is a big part of their model. So they are cartographic entities, in much the same way that Google is cartographic, right? Google created maps of the web. Facebook creates maps of our relationships. RBMA and Boiler Room have been busy creating maps of culture, and maps are valuable as they allow for the establishment of trade routes. So on the one hand, RBMA and Boiler Room do a great job in the sense that their models are predicated on the primacy of the kind of cultures that are under threat by the algorithmic populism of Spotify. They hire good people. They hire knowledgeable local promoters and journalists who at this point of writing have done an admirable job of drawing attention to artists whose goal is to advance the form in much the same way that labels used to scout and put artists on the map. In light of the slow heat death of the critical infrastructure, there's a big part of me that despairs as to what the musical landscape would look like without entities like RBMA and Boiler Room artificially inflating the value of challenging music. And let's be clear, this is an artificial inflation. I know intimately that there are few other viable models for challenging artists to create large live shows and be so visible in the conversation without this injection of cash and visibility. So as things stand, the money isn't there outside of the very functional parallel club model I outlined previously. It's also quite miraculous that these organizations have managed to do so quite unconditionally with regards to the kind of art that they support. So long as you are cool with the association, which many are not, there really aren't any creative restrictions as to the work you can make. Why is that? How can that be? So contrary to the hackneyed divisions that linger from the past, there really is no mainstream or underground in this new economy. Under ad-driven platform capitalism, there are either fertile pathways to sell people stuff or barren and quantified pathways to sell people stuff. It's a map. And I've said a million times in this economy, unique niches or unexplored corners are highly valuable. If you are an artist whose practice speaks to a unique intersection, say based on genre, identity, or personal narrative, then you are an interesting proposition to advertisers as you are prospectively establishing new territory to sell people stuff. Brands, as patrons, want you to establish new territory on their behalf and be the first to that party. So, also a cold light of day reading of the prominence of representation politics in the current media landscape can borrow a lot from this observation. Think about it this way. How does one generate value from what is ostensibly an overabundance of music and culture? Through narrative and identification rituals. You ought to care about this because this is for you. You being the new and untapped market previously untouched by more generalized marketing efforts. This is a legitimate adaptation strategy to the platform era, but inarguably deprioritizes the development of the musical form. So, for example, if now millions of people have the tools to create good enough Jeff Mills derivative techno tracks, it only makes sense that the distinguishing logic that someone might use to opt to support producer X over producer Y would heavily focus on tangential narrative elements. So much so that these narrative elements become the main source of value when competing with art of similar formal characteristics. Those tangential elements are perhaps better understood as metadata, equally optimal for growing new audiences and courting the interest of brands looking to achieve visibility in new niche markets. So in most cases, these kind of intersections happen earnestly and without cynicism, but it's, however, important to demystify why indeed these niches are compelling to brands and understand that unless your niche is ideologically fortified from any brand participation, most likely someone within that niche will often opt to establish those pathways and sell people stuff. That's the platform economy as things stand. So this raises an interesting conundrum. Brands are fundamentally interested in artists doing whatever they want, and intermediaries such as RBMA have found an impressively seamless model to fund those artists' eclectic visions and continue the kind of specialist archival model of music that the algorithmic populist platforms have decimated in the form of labels and magazines. Yet some people are still passionately upset about it. Why? So, I grew up an independent musical zealot, a romantic. I can't shake many aspects of it. The anomalous period of time when physical musical sales were lucrative provided a healthy economic environment for local music communities to represent themselves and raise sufficient money by creating maps of the culture emerging around them, which in turn supported diverse and distinct visions of music's future. So Warp Records, classic example, started on a £40 enterprise allowance grant from the state, and in their early days managed to sell 130,000 copies of the first groundbreaking single by LFO. 130,000 copies, that's a lot of money. So I started working when I was 18, I started working at a label called Southern Records, one of the kind of pioneering labels in the independent musical sphere, and allegedly Crass, who were involved in founding that, sold 1.5 million albums, allegedly. So the original indie pioneers did a great service to music, but let's be real. They've left us with an impossible burden of a legacy that we cannot continue. Record sales equaled money in the bank, which equaled options, period. Options to say no, options to do wild and risky things. Who has those options today? Where would the money come from? More interestingly, perhaps, is to ask the question, what is the ideological difference between the principles of the original indies and this new climate of brand partnerships? This feels like an important question to unpack, as in my mind, this distinction accounts for the vast majority of anger around this topic. I'd like to move the conversation on from that. So the original indies, as far as I can tell, were predicated on two firm principles. The majors were corrupt, they strong-armed bad music into the popular spotlight, and they ignored radical new developments in music creation and localized scenes that needed to be represented and weren't being represented. On the other hand, independence meant being able to do whatever you want, however you wanted it, with no one above you influencing your creative decisions. Self-sufficiency, basically. People who colluded with brands were considered sellouts, as they had to tame their vision to appeal to a wider audience and secure that funding. So that's about it, really, in a nutshell. So where are the ideological differences here? I can see them clearly in opposition to the algorithmic populism of, say, a Spotify or a YouTube, who I've long regarded as being the natural inheritors to the major labels of yore in terms of their ability to put shitty culture in front of people and create monopolies of attention around the artists who they elect to represent their interests. But as I've clarified, most brands and the intermediaries that negotiate funds from them put a premium on artists doing what they want unconditionally, as the model that funds those operations depends on new and novel narratives emerging to create uncharted pathways to sell people stuff. That's platform capitalism. Think about it. So what views could you want to air that are incompatible with a brand partnership, particularly through the abstracted lens of an intermediary? I've known of a handful of eco-activist projects in my lifetime, but they'd also presumably not be cool with the manufacturing of vinyl under the traditional label system or the dependence on fuel-burning transportation in the live economy. I know of more people who cite concerns about the gentrifying effects of transnational cultural institutions spending money across the globe, but let's be honest, indie music scenes of socially mobile young artists were doing just fine at gentrifying neighborhoods before brand money got involved. So in the vast majority of cases, what is the inconsistency here? Warp or Discord or 4AD or whatever, they weren't communist enterprises. They aren't radical free culture enterprises. No, they are and were, for better or worse, entities that made great strides to support the individual visions of unique artists and help them to gain prominence in the market for music. And for a period of time, symbiotically reap the rewards from sales of that work. None of these labels were cooperatives, where the profits from individual album sales were pooled and divided up between all community participants equally, or shared with local residents in solidarity against gentrification. There are fringe, isolated examples of this, but that would be far from the standard order of operations. So in many ways, the foundational logic of independent music won, and Liz has spoken about this herself. Now large portions of the economy are predicated on the promise of individualist independence. Everybody is free to self-publish their unique perspective and hypothetically find an audience for it online. That being said, we hardly live in a utopia as a result. Now many people are precarious independent agents floating around a market economy. So you're free to drive an Uber, deliver someone some food. You're independent enough to be able to make your own schedule. I don't think many people are very happy with this. So of course, what we see when these fragile romantic ideologies of yore are taken to their logical conclusion is also that not everybody is equally independent at birth. It's no secret that many of the original indies were founded by the wealthy, or in many cases by middle-class entrepreneurs who could afford to dedicate their 20s to a speculative cultural business. Similarly today, I would argue that this kind of erosion of institutions has led to a stratification of culture that threatens ideological monopoly and conceptual stagnation. The risk takers who can afford to, say, reject brown money to fuel their artwork are often upper middle class artists who have a plan B and C if things don't work out. Who has the flexibility to take risks if no one is willing to pay artists to take them? So it makes sense that if everyone is truly independent of institutions, that would go some way to redress societal imbalances with curation or stimulus funds, those with more resources or connections will end up being able to operate more independently than others. Platform logic, under the seductive narratives of equal access and democratization, has gutted the institutions and habits, i.e. paying for stuff, that make artistic social mobility possible. Equal ability to publish something means nothing when only those with the ability to fund promotion of the work are discovered, which Liz brought up earlier in her talk. And I've said it before, there will be an abundance of free culture and free time in the slums. Amazon can produce your product cheaper than you can and strong-arm you out of business until you work with them. Facebook can acquire any competitor before they become dangerous to Facebook. Pop music can appropriate and spit out your micro-scene before it has any ability to generate its own momentum or its own funds. In 2019, we all work for Kanye West, and only some of us have figured out how to get paid for it. It's fucking true. So, in the absence of the ability to accrue a foundation of wealth and stability for new music, independent artists who gain prominence via the centralized media channels of the 80s and 90s will reign supreme over the long tail of precarious younger artists until the day they choose to call it quits. The gravitational pull of those artists who establish the categories by which playlists and festival lineups must orient themselves to reach enough people dictates that most new music emerging needs to flatter the formal and conceptual foundations of those pioneers. There's going to be a whole lot more music that flatters the impressive legacies of Aphex Twin, Bjork, Timbaland, Missy Elliott, Aaliyah, Jeff Mills, etc., as those are the kind of petrified shapes of envelope-pushing music from just before the volcano of Web 2 went off. Radical music culture circa 1996 preserved forever, like the ruins of Pompeii, or as Mark Fisher, rest in peace, referred to it, a kind of permanent 90s. With respect to the accomplishment of those legacies, this is all a bit weird. As for my money, the world we lived in has changed so dramatically in the past 20 years that it feels a little like a failure to be creating artwork in the permanent shadow of artworks made in a dramatically different socioeconomic context. One wonders if the impressive accomplishments of the artists before mentioned could have ever been possible under those same restrictions or expectations. So in conclusion, I'm yet to hear a strong argument as to what the ideological distinction is between the original indie legacies and this new era of brand-aligned scene maps. Good news. You aren't a hypocrite for participating in that economy, and as far as I'm concerned, I won't judge you for doing so. I'm actually exhilarated that the vast majority of practices, for the vast majority of practices and for working class or traditionally marginalized artists, there's still at least one way to make your work unconditionally and find an audience outside of the abjectly dystopian free market populism of the platform monopolies. So then everything's good, right? No, it's not. So we still have a really sticky and unfortunate problem. What of all these wonderful gatekeepers and intermediaries who have contributed so much and still have so much to contribute to the development of new and interesting music? What of the niche festivals like this one? The local DIY organizers, the labels and thoughtful journalists and editors, the people who've weathered the storm to this point? What will become of them? I loathe to say it, but I think that things are going to get way worse. Why? Well, on the one hand, the platform monopolies like Spotify and YouTube are going to continually erode your influence with every new person that comes online. Their algorithms will direct traffic away from your priorities and towards theirs, and to survive in that ecosystem, you will need to satisfy their agenda. That doesn't sound very independent to me. Journalists will have to write more about what Spotify prioritizes. Artists will have to make work to satisfy the debased formal requirements of those platforms. Labels will be shooed off like annoying pests that are messing with the platform's long-term vision. Spotify already communicates this implicitly in how little they acknowledge the role of the label in the creation of this music. Really, really bad, and a great reason to be really, really angry, I think. So what then about these new kind of intermediaries, the organizations that successfully managed to leverage brand money towards supporting culture? If your previous kind of raison d'etre was to support marginal communities and weird music, you're probably going to end up being outcompeted by them. Models that manage to leverage brand money to support those communities will grow and grow in prominence. There's no longer nothing off limits. If you're a kind of marginal festival used to support queer culture or emphasize women or emphasize a certain kind of political affiliation, that stuff is no longer out of bounds for brand money, and so you're going to struggle. The thing is, if you're playing exactly the same game, and one entity found a model to support exactly the same thing that you have supported traditionally, but more effectively and more profitably, then you're going to lose that game. It sucks, but that's what's likely going to happen. So let's also add to the mix the state of affairs globally. Brexit, stricter and stricter American border control, a potential decline in EU funding for cultural festivals, and general nativist political turn across the board. It's pretty depressing, and I propose quite a good reason to think hard about what the hell we're doing as a community. If we are indeed still a community with agency who can figure things out together, rather than a bunch of platform mercenaries stepping on top of each other for a moment in the spotlight. It's going to cost a whole bunch of money and expertise to arrange those visas and keep international cultural conversations circulating. And to give credit where it's due to an organization like RBMA, this is something I don't think they get enough credit for doing. Quietly over the years, they have funded and made possible so many careers on the basis of punitive kind of border restrictions. So for the next few years at least, I think organizations like an RBMA or like a Boiler Room, in parallel to the kind of state-supported festivals that we find ourselves in at the moment, are going to continue to be key to maintaining some semblance of musical progress consistent with the legacy of the archive that has been established. Buttressing scenes from attack from both the platform monopolies and unconscionable political developments. If you are competitive with them, though, I think it makes sense to reconsider your model. However, so despite my insistence that those entities be acknowledged, I also think we're in dire need of viable, complementary, and antagonistic new models of music infrastructure. So for a few reasons. I mean, I think one, the cultural cartography model discussed is quite precarious, as in order to maintain that cultural cartography model, you need new shit to be happening. Companies dependent on brand money are always a couple of emails away from being out of favor. State-supported festivals are very fragile to that possibility too. As the popular narrative that Spotify is solving the problem of music, which if you speak to a lot of people in tech, that's exactly the perspective that they have. As that opinion proliferates further, it's going to become increasingly difficult for people to convince brands or an increasingly conservative state that these niche pockets of music we might care about are worth the investment. Stat-supported music, if unimpeded, will come into direct conflict with state-supported music. So I actually think that it's in everyone's interests for new models to emerge. I think some of the models can be complementary and some can be antagonistic, and ideally we'd see a bunch come up. And as I said before, one reason I see things going south for competitors to the brand-aligned organizations is that they are competitive. And you solve this problem of being competitive quite easily by becoming uncompetitive or doing something that they cannot do. So one thing that brands or their intermediaries can't do, for example, is distribute ownership under a cooperative model. They literally can't do that. Nike literally cannot do that. But there are all kinds of reasons why that might make sense for various different cultural scenes or organizations. Cooperativizing creates loyalty and an alignment of interests between organizational, festivals, artists, and audience. Cooperativizing allows for collective strategizing toward common objectives. Rather than funds being ingested to the benefit of one artist in competition with another, those same funds can be channeled into infrastructure that helps everybody and helps keep the culture afloat. Cooperatives can make a profit and can even receive brand money. For example, if brand X comes along and says, we want to support your culture under a robust cooperative, your culture can say, do so by funding our cooperative. This kind of collective bargaining is also smart business, as you have far more collateral to negotiate, and thus can potentially bargain for more ambitious things than, say, simply a gig here or there for one or two lucky representatives of your scene. A strong co-op presence in a city or scene can fortify it from hypothetically pernicious brand money displacing what you do. Like a union, if brand X wants to come into your town, perhaps they will need to negotiate with terms of the group, if you can succeed in convincing enough people to build it. Cooperative thinking is an uncompetitive model with the potential to hold its own in this new environment. If you believe in something dearly, it might be worth testing it and seeing if others can get on board with it. I can see cooperative festivals tied to PAPS labels becoming a really feasible international proposition in which people have a say on who comes to perform and who is released and look forward all year to joining their fellow community members in real life. It's not the most lucrative idea, but it would be sustainable and resilient. And membership and co-op models have worked for decades in hacker spaces, and those people are quite smart. That'd be quite a dream to think of scene-based logics focused enough in their differing convictions to be able to grow robust cooperatives around what they do. Some might choose to partner with brands and intermediaries unconditionally. Some might insert conditions, while others might reject that path entirely, but there would at least be some proactive forward momentum. The challenge, however, is that when asked most people about the prospect of pegging their opportunities and earning potential to a cooperative of their peers, many are skeptical. As things stand, this is a very marginal position. Despite how resilient it might be, most just want to make tracks and put them out there. And that's fine. But if you're both skeptical of brand alignments and cooperative structures, you will need another proposal. Unless there's a transformational political upheaval that I don't see on the horizon, I really don't think there's any going backwards. So I do think, however, it's worth considering the option. I fucked up this sentence. Yeah, we'll move on. Decentralization. So to explain what decentralization is, I mean, interestingly, like the legacy of music is a decentralized one. I remember, so my partner was asked to do something, and for some reason she had to look up the Wikipedia, like the charts from the year in 1984, and it's quite interesting to think that in a sense, at the most centralized point in time, when you had these majors basically ran the music industry, this is kind of pre the ability to easily create your own records and ship them around, you look at the charts and it's like incredible the amount of different things coming from different locales that made its way to the charts. And in a sense, a lot of that I think you can attribute to the natural decentralization of the world before the internet was around, right? Like the fact that you would have a community in Baltimore or a community in Detroit or a community in Brussels being naturally kind of decentralized from each other, and would have to communicate with each other through the telecommunication network of shipping records around. But in a way, I think that the general diversity of ideas and styles that one would associate with an older music industry can in many ways be attributed to a form of decentralization. But for this, I'm going to talk more about decentralization in kind of a technical emphasis, and I'm going to use the founder of Ethereum, Vitalik Buterin's model, just because he made it quite simple to convey. So he breaks decentralization into three groups, right? We're talking about computer networks now, but you can use your imagination. Architectural decentralization. So how many physical computers is the system made up of? How many of those computers can it tolerate breaking down at any single time? So in that case, you could think of something, I'm sure everybody here has used a torrent system, right? If one seeder goes down, not all seeds go down. The file is still available. Torrent systems are incredibly decentralized. Political decentralization. How many individuals or organizations ultimately control the computers that the system is made up of? The parallel here would be to think of something like a Spotify, which has a centralized governance body, a very opaque centralized governance body. We don't know what priorities the designers are encoding into their system. We are simply asked to participate and kind of figure it out over time, thanks to the work of people like Liz. And logical decentralization. Does the interface and data structures that the system presents and maintain look more like a single monolithic object or an amorphous swarm? One simple heuristic for logical decentralization is if you cut the system in half, including both providers and users, will both halves continue to fully operate as independent units? I think that explains itself. It's a many-headed hydra. So benefits of decentralization in the context of music. So the network and archive is hard to take down. If SoundCloud fails, which we came very, very close to a couple of years ago, and I wouldn't be surprised if we come very, very close to in a couple of years' time too, what happens to all that music and the activity around it? What happens to the decade of culture that has been logged and recorded there? If a magazine goes down, what happens to all of that history? I think it's really worth thinking about this. Decentralized systems such as IPFS that propose a peer-to-peer immutable web, an archive that you cannot take down, are worth entertaining for this reason. Simply for the simple fact of not losing history. And also for all the artists who perhaps have gathered great followings on these platforms only to find themselves starting at square one. Regarding political decentralization, this can be approached by entertaining ideas of common ownership. Rather than the centralized team at Spotify or YouTube making decisions that determine how your artwork is distributed, or the logics by which some work is more visible and prioritized over other work, politically decentralized networks entertain the possibility of pluralistic and democratic decision-making. Decentralized networks, when dealing with an open source code base, also allow for forking. If you don't like the way things work, you're encouraged to take the code and build something over here that disagrees with it. Over time, what this mechanism creates is a healthy competition of ideas and participant choice. So, a few interesting ideas to come out of the decentralized space in recent years I'm going to try and explain. The first one, which I never want to overly prioritize, kind of the crypto blockchain-y projects. So DAT is the first one that I bring forward. And DAT is a peer-to-peer ecosystem. They're building basically a parallel web using many of the same principles as BitTorrent to maintain a permanent archive with its own browser. BitTorrent, of course, recently acquired by Tron, a blockchain-based company, for better or worse. Smart contract platforms. So some of you might know, years ago now, I developed a decentralized publishing framework, and that's all very boring, but one of the more interesting ideas behind it was the idea of a smart contract. It was the idea of saying, I can put into code the ability to say where my work goes and how it reacts in certain different environments. If someone is playing my track in Saudi Arabia, I want it to do this. If someone is playing my track in Canada, I want it to do that. If someone plays my track 5,000 times on a web page that also registers advertisements, I'm going to throw a paywall up. If someone is posting my track to their blog and it only gets paid 15 times, they can have it for free. Smart contracts basically are a vending machine logic by which you can attribute rules to content or media. Super interesting. Also, incredibly interesting, there's an organization called Ethereum. Before I talk about any of this, big disclaimer, don't put $1 or €1 of your money into anything I'm talking about, because the markets are insane, and it would be incredibly irresponsible for me to encourage you to do that. But Ethereum as a smart contract platform is incredibly interesting. So Ethereum, to put it in a nutshell, if people have heard of Bitcoin, Bitcoin is a decentralized node-based ledger for, cryptocurrency to allow for people to transact on a thing called a blockchain. The great innovation of Ethereum was, rather than simply registering numbers on each block to register transactions, instead Ethereum, more like an Excel spreadsheet, allows for you to put computer code inside each block on the blockchain, ostensibly then creating a kind of autonomous world supercomputer that can execute anything dependent on the rules encoded into it. Some cool ideas. Oh yeah, here's the vending machine. I found this in Johnson City, Tennessee in a mall. It's a vending machine called Protocol. I thought that was really cool. And hopefully now you understand why I think it was really cool. Super interesting ideas coming from these kind of tokenized smart contract systems is when you can build rules, incredibly complex rule ecosystems using smart contracts, you can have some pretty wild ideas, one of which being something called Terra Zero, which is a bunch of artists actually based in Berlin. I'd encourage you to check them out, who started thinking, can an augmented forest own and utilize itself? Can we give a forest, so a relatively inanimate entity, can we encode into it rules that allow for it to regulate how much it is being forested? Really kind of wild ideas, but not that unrealistic once you start thinking about thinking through smart contracts. Other ideas such as tokenization. So the Ethereum network, for example, uses something called tokens. They tend to be fungible, so you can transfer one for the other without it meaning anything. There's also non-fungible tokens, but that's kind of another question. And what tokens do is they allow for you to distribute value and equity in projects with some kind of a digital token, which is kind of really interesting, right? It's the Ethereum, as far as I'm aware, was the first kind of ICO, this idea of an initial coin offering in which you, kind of like a Kickstarter or like any kind of fundraising platform, you could invest, say, $100 of your money and then get rewarded in return with tokens that represent a stake in the overall value of the Ethereum network, a unit of transaction, a unit of value that you could then transact for goods and services, and also a voting right in terms of, if you were to think about the cooperative idea, a passport to say, hey, because I have this token, I might stake a vote if you choose to vote on one project or another. Interesting things that are happening with tokens right now. There's a project called Gitcoin that I'm particularly interested in, which is looking to basically tokenize GitHub, the open source kind of code facilitating area. And Gitcoin is using tokens to incentivize bounties. So if you're building a project and you're looking for someone in the ether to contribute to that project, you can use tokens to coax people to help you to build something who you might not have met. And a couple of years ago, for various reasons that I don't want to go into, but I put forward kind of a proposal to talk about tokenizing SoundCloud. What would it mean if 49% of SoundCloud equity was distributed to everybody who's contributed value to it? Would that be a business model that would actually keep it afloat? So tokens are super interesting. Oh, that's a token. I should have done that. On top of that, the idea of a DAO. So a decentralized autonomous organization is another idea that's being experimented with at the moment. So a DAO, in a sense, is a combination of a smart contract system, so encoding rules into a system, encoding a protocol into the way a system works, and tokenized governance. So you can create pools of money, pools of value, and collectively determine what that group invests in, and collectively share the spoils, potentially, of that proceed. So it's quite easy to see, once you understand the DAO model, it's quite easy to see the idea of DAO labels, DAO publications, DAO festivals. Ostensibly, what we're talking about here are membership guilds, common but distributed groups of people who share an interest in something and who retain that value within their organization of people. There are a number of DAOs deployed, for example, on the Ethereum network, with the idea being of, what do you and 5,000 other people want to prioritize funding? Super cool. Another thing that I think is really worth noting, and this I'll start this with kind of a music anecdote, is the one thing that really struck me. I went to that festival Atonal was happening. This is a couple of years ago now. And before that, some friends of mine from San Francisco had come, and they were playing a show at the Kopi, which those of you from Berlin will know is the kind of a classic squat space that's across the road from Tresor. And so I walked into Kopi, and I was standing there with a bunch of people, and it basically looked like the 1980s there. You had a bunch of people who basically look like they're in Napalm Death. Still, I mean, I don't know how you're like 17, but you look like it's 1987, and then I go over to Atonal, and then there's a bunch of people who look like it was like 1989, and they're all wearing like industrial clothing, and I'm like, it struck me, I'm like, if you own the space, you own the culture, right? There's a reason people still dance to the same music that they did in 1991, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the spaces from 1991 are still standing there. And they decided to still push that. And so I started thinking more and more about spaces as being things that we kind of expect them to be there, but they haven't really changed very much in a long time. And I think that's partly why. I think that spaces are incumbent or burdened in many ways with a history that can be equally wonderful and orthodox. And so, I've been looking, for example, there's this company, Brickblock, which is a company based in Berlin that's almost a nightmare model where they're lobbying in Luxembourg right now to figure out how to tokenize physical assets. So there's a big problem in the crypto space. Basically, I can give you a token. It could be worth anything. But if I sell you a token and I say this is worth, 1% of this building, right now it's not a legally defensible thing. I could sell that to you. It would basically be a scam. And you wouldn't be able to take me to court and say, well, that person, that stuff's complicated, like deeds and titles and all this kind of stuff is complicated. But people are working on this. And Brickblock's vision, for example, is the ability for an abstract number of people to invest in tokens that represent value in real estate. So if you think gentrification is bad now, wait till the entire Chinese middle class can invest in the street and own 0.001% of your apartment building. Right? So irrespective of whether you like this idea and this model approach to culture, it's worth knowing that that's in the works. So to flip the conversation a little bit, I look at that and I say, well, what if we could collectively run, through tokenized models, collectively run our own spaces? Wouldn't that be a really, really interesting idea? The joke is, could 5,000 fans of deconstructed club music collectively design, own, and program a reconstructed vision of what a club space is, with its own protocols for value and distribution of payment and opportunities? Could it be possible? Here's a bunch of Italian designers who were doing it in the 1970s, and there's many, many more clubs that they designed with their own kind of rules and logics back then. So it is absolutely possible, and I'd love to explore that more. So the point being with protocols is, you know, it's a wonderful word because it describes both kind of human relations, us coming to terms with what we actually value and what we actually want to do, and of course to technical infrastructure. And I think a merging of those two things in the next few years is really the best and most exciting, to be quite honest, opportunity that we have. And so as a little experiment, just to confirm kind of what I was saying earlier, I started thinking, and this was literally written in the cab on the way here, so excuse me if it's a bit kind of glib. But looking at indie musician, what is the foundational protocol of an indie musician? I want to be free to release what I want with no institution telling me what to create. What do the platform capitalists and the branded funders say? Sure, go ahead. Together we will overwhelm the institutions so that they will never impede your creativity again, right? What is the archetype of the DJ? Which I get flack for this, but I will die on this sword or whatever that statement is. A DJ says, I want to be free to earn money curating and performing the artwork I discover in the world and not be held responsible to accredit or compensate the creator. That's the protocol of the DJ. And the web and the platform capitalists and the brand funders say, feel free. The protocols of the web were built with this exact ideology in mind, which they actually were. If you go back to Tim Berners-Lee and you look at the foundational arguments about the internet, the core argument was an ideological dispute between Ted Nelson, a personal hero of mine, who wanted to make a one-world archive in which every reference to my work led back to me, and Tim Berners-Lee, who at the time was, you know, a hippie, free culture ideologue, who was like, no, you should be free to collage work in whatever way you want, and that's the way the world looks, and that's also the ideology behind a lot of the DJ economy. And so nothing wrong with that, but we should be clear in going to first principles to understand what the core protocol is there. And so then I'll speculate on a couple more. Proto-guild member, whatever. So I want for members of my community to be DAO members. I want to host a node. I want each of them to host a node to maintain our archive and contribute $100 yearly to subsidize the creation of new works only accessible to guild members. Compatibility with platform capitalists. Can we negotiate to scan your archive, please? Do you have a corporate rate? Proto-world builder. I want from my club to pay artists the second that their work is played and commission new works only to be played in the club to drive membership. 2% of my profits I want to go to the neighbors so that we do not displace small businesses in the neighborhood. The compatibility with platform capitalism and branded funders is, wait, we want access to this club. What do you mean we can't have access to this club unless we buy your sound system for you? Anyway, so I've been ranting a lot, and thanks for encouraging me. But these are a bunch of links. I'd encourage you, if you're going to like take a picture of anything, I'd take a picture of these. These are a bunch of projects that are happening in Berlin that pretty much around about. I can go into any number of them personally or whatever, but it's better to check them out yourself. People thinking about new infrastructure, people thinking about decentralization of culture. One of these might work. 5 of them might be dangerous. Yeah, that's where I'm focusing my attention. I just encourage everybody. I encourage everybody to do the same. So thank you.